The doors hit the walls. Not a knock, not a request. The double doors of the 38th floor executive suite swung open so hard they bounced off the interior walls, and every head in the conference room turned at exactly the same moment. 12 executives, 4 senior directors, 2 armed security personnel, all of them looking at the woman who had just walked through those doors like she'd already decided the room belonged to her. Candace Brooks was 29 years old, 5'8", with the kind of posture that comes from being a minister's daughter in rooms full of people twice her age since she was 14. Her dark skin caught the overhead light as she moved. The deep brown of it contrasted against the crisp white of her fitted blazer. Her natural hair was pulled back sharply, every edge deliberate. She was dressed like a woman who had come to work. She moved like a woman who had come to war. She didn't acknowledge the armed men who stepped into her path. She walked through the gap between them without slowing down, without making eye contact, without giving them anything to work with. And the only reason they didn't physically stop her was because no one in the history of this floor had ever come through those doors like that, and neither of them had a protocol for a woman who moved like she was already certain of the outcome. The assistant who'd been chasing her from the elevator reached the doorway and stopped. Too late. Candace crossed the conference room in 10 seconds. She dropped the government appointment file flat on the glass table in front of the man at the head of it. Hard. Hard enough that the executive to his left physically pushed back from the table on instinct. Then she pointed directly at him. "I want to know," she said, and her voice was steady the way something is steady right before it breaks. "Why my father signed a government document placing his only daughter inside your organization. What you offered him. And how long you've had your hand on his decisions." The room went the kind of quiet that doesn't have a natural end. And the man she was pointing at did not react. Lee Min-ho was 34 years old with the kind of stillness that is not the same thing as calm. It was more specific than calm, more deliberate. He was lean and dark-eyed, Korean in his features, and something harder than Korean in his expression, the kind of man whose face gave you information only when he chose to give it. He'd been sitting at the head of that table since 7 in the morning. He hadn't moved when the doors opened. He hadn't moved when she crossed the room. He had simply watched her cover the distance between the doors and him, and when she stopped and pointed, he looked at her finger and then looked at her face. He set the pen down. He didn't look at the file. He looked at her. For long enough that the silence in the room went from tense to something else, something that wasn't quite comfortable, but wasn't quite pressure either. It was the specific quality of silence produced by a man who was not in a hurry and had decided you were going to understand that. "The door," he said, "is still open." Quiet, not a threat, not a dismissal, like he was simply nodding a fact about the room. "If you've decided not to accept the assignment." Candace stared at him. He was not rattled. That landed before anything else did, because she had prepared for every version of this moment except that one. She'd prepared for denial, for cold authority, for the particular brand of powerful man irritation that moves through a legal team before it moves through a conversation. She'd rehearsed responses to all of them in her apartment at 2 in the morning and again in the car on the way here. She had not prepared for a man who looked at her like she was information he was filing away for later. "I'm not here to accept anything," she said. "Whatever agreement you made with my father ends today." He tilted his head, just slightly, a specific kind of question without a question mark. "Does your father know you're here?" "My father sent me here, with that file." She held his gaze. "And I want you to explain to me why a man who spent 30 years fighting corruption in this government decided the right move was handing his daughter to the most feared organization in Korea." One of the executives shifted in his chair. The sound it made was enormous in that silence. Lee Min-ho stood up. She'd seen photographs. Everyone in Korea had seen photographs. But photographs don't capture the quality of space a man occupies when a room already belongs to him, and he knows it without needing to prove it. He was taller than she'd registered. The dark suit, no tie, close enough now that she could see the faint shadow under his eyes that told her he'd also been awake at 2 in the morning, just not rehearsing anything. He looked at the room. "We'll continue at 4, he said. 12 people stood up and left in under a minute. It was actually remarkable how quickly $400,000 an hour of executive talent could disappear when one man looked at a table and decided the meeting was over. The room emptied. The man in the charcoal suit near the window stayed. Kim Jae-hoon. She'd figure out who he was in the next hour. Min-ho picked up the appointment file. Read it the way he probably read every document, thoroughly, without performing the act of reading, without looking up to see if she was still watching him. She was still watching him. Kim Jae-hoon. The man near the window moved forward. Show Ms. Brooks to the Executive Affairs Office. Standard clearance. Restricted wings pending review. I haven't agreed to anything, she said. Min-ho looked up from the file, looked at her. Something in his expression was almost not amusement, but the thing that exists just before amusement decides whether to arrive. No, he said, but you're still here. She was still here. She turned and followed Jae-hoon out of the room because she needed to be inside this building, not outside it. And because the man at the end of that table was already making her feel like she'd walked in knowing less than she thought she did, and she could not afford that. She hated that feeling. She hated it more than she'd hated walking in. The Executive Affairs Office was one floor below his suite, floor-to-ceiling windows, a desk that had never been used for anything ordinary, a bookshelf organized with such precision that someone had clearly known it would be examined, had organized it for an audience. She noticed that immediately. Kim Jae-hoon walked her through the shared access system with the practiced patience of a man who'd done this orientation before, for someone else, which meant this was already a known process, which meant she was not the first person to be placed in this position. She filed that. She waited until his footsteps faded down the hallway. Then she opened the system and started looking for what the orientation document hadn't covered. 3 restricted partitions in 40 minutes. The third one disappeared as she found it, access suspended from somewhere above her before she could press further. The screen presented a clearance error notification with no name attached. He'd been watching her move through the system. Of course he had. She called her father. 7 rings. He answered on the 7th with the specific tone of a man who'd been expecting a call and had been trying to get ready for it. Candace. I'm in the building. She heard him deciding how much to say. She knew that pause. She'd been listening to it her entire life, at dinner tables, in official cars, in the background of late phone calls when she was in university, and he was managing things she wasn't supposed to know about yet. How did it go? He's not what I expected. He rarely is, her father said. The way he said it told her this wasn't an observation. It was something he knew from experience, from time. Dad, tell me what this actually is. The silence went on long enough that she genuinely thought he might. Not yet, he said. Do your job, watch, and call me when you have something specific. He ended the call. She sat with the phone in her hand and the locked screen in front of her and thought about a man who had looked at her like she was information rather than a problem. And thought about what the difference between those two things was and whether it mattered, and decided it mattered a great deal. She got back to work. The first week was a war of patience, and Min-ho was better at it than she was. Not because he outmaneuvered her, he didn't need to. He simply operated on a different clock. Every file she requested came back with specific sections excised. Not sloppy redactions, precise ones. The kind that take years to calibrate, where you learn exactly which lines reveal nothing and which ones reveal everything, and you remove only the ones that matter. Every meeting she was permitted to attend had a pre-meeting and a post-meeting that she wasn't in. She caught the edge of one through a glass partition on her 3rd day. 4 men she didn't recognize leaving a conference room with the specific body language of people who just agreed on something. She memorized their faces. Spent that evening cross-referencing them in public directories. 2 of them didn't exist in any. She changed her approach around day 5. Stopped trying to pull what was locked and started watching what wasn't. The loading dock on the south side. The vendor names in the publicly accessible registry that matched no physical addresses. The 3 black SUVs that left the building on Tuesday and Thursday evenings through rotating exits, always between 6:45 and 7:30, always by different routes. On the 9th day, she followed one. She made it 6 blocks before the SUV pulled to the curb ahead of her taxi, not stopping because traffic had stopped, stopping because it had chosen to stop in a specific position. And the back door opened, and Kim Jae-hoon looked out at her with the expression of a man who had already known she'd be there before she'd made the decision to be there. "Mr. Lee would like to offer you a ride," he said, "since you're going the same direction." She stood on the sidewalk in the cold for 4 seconds. Then she got in, because she needed to know where the car was going more than she needed to protect the appearance of having the upper hand. Lee Min-ho was already inside, reading his phone, which he didn't put away when she sat down across from him. The car pulled smoothly back into traffic. He finished what he was reading, put the phone away, and looked at her like he'd already known she'd be sitting there and was simply giving her a moment to arrange herself before the conversation started. "You could have told me to stop," she said. "You would have found another way." "You don't know that." "You came in through the main entrance on your first day," he said, "found 3 restricted partitions in 40 minutes, then spent 9 days watching our south loading dock before you flagged one of our vehicles." He looked at her steadily. "I know that." There was something she hadn't expected in the way he said it. Not irritation, not a warning, almost like he was telling her she'd done well. She held his gaze. "Most men in your position would have had me removed." "I agreed to have you here," he said simply. "That's not the same position." "Then tell me why." He looked at her for a moment. Not the practiced assessment she'd been getting from him all week. This was something slightly different, something that took its time. Like he was deciding how much of something to give her and how much to hold back, and the calculation was more complicated than she'd expected it to be. "Because," he said, and then stopped. Like even those 2 words were more than he'd planned to say in this car tonight. Outside the window, Seoul moved past in the dark. The city lit in layers, streetlights and signage, and the warm glow of restaurant windows, the distant structural light of towers further east. The driver hadn't spoken since they pulled out. The interior of the car was quiet in the specific way that quiet becomes when 2 people are close enough to have a different kind of conversation, and neither one of them has decided yet whether to have it. Candace looked at his profile, the clean line of his jaw, the faint shadow under his eyes that told her he ran on less sleep than he should and had made peace with that a long time ago. She caught herself noticing and redirected back to his hands, which were resting still on his knees, and to what those hands likely managed and what that management cost. She was here to figure out what he was, not to sit in his car noticing the shadow under his eyes. "Tonight," he said finally, "I'll show you something. Whether you ask why after that is up to you." She looked back out the window and told herself that the fact that she wanted to ask why right now, in this car, was simply because she was good at her job. That was all it was. The community center in Mapo district was nothing like what she'd constructed during the drive. She'd expected something that existed on paper. The kind of charitable investment that looks good in an annual report and runs at minimum capacity because the point was always the optics, never the outcome. A clean building with a polished front entrance and services that were technically operational and functionally hollow. She was wrong. The main corridor was full. Families moving in both directions, parents with small children, teenagers who carried themselves with the comfort of people who'd chosen to be there rather than been sent. A cooking class running in a side room, real food, real smell. A woman who appeared to be in her 60s running it with the authority of someone who had been there for years and intended to be there for years more. A board near the entrance covered in photographs that people had brought from home. The kind of photographs that mean something specific to specific people and nothing to anyone else. The staff greeted Min-ho the way you greet someone who shows up reliably. Not the deference of organizational management performing for a donor. The ease of people who know that when this particular person walks through the door, things move. He knew names. He asked real questions, Not how are things in the general social sense, but questions about specific situations she could tell he'd been tracking between visits. A family's housing status, a child's school enrollment, whether illegal filing had progressed. Candace stayed back and watched him work the room, and she thought about the word feared, and the man in front of her, and the distance between those two things. She was still thinking about it when he turned and looked directly at her from across the room. She hadn't realized she'd been watching him that openly. She'd stopped moving somewhere near the entrance, jacket still on, and she was standing there with her arms loose at her sides and no expression she could identify on her face, which meant whatever expression was there was real, which was a problem. Minho didn't say anything from across the room, didn't gesture. He just held her gaze for a moment, the same way he'd held it across the conference table on the first day, except this time there was no table between them and no performance of power on either side. Just two people in a community center that smelled like good food, with about 20 feet of space and a lot of unresolved questions in between. Then he turned back to the family he'd been speaking with, like the moment hadn't happened. She told herself it hadn't happened. Told herself it was simply the habit of observation working in both directions, and that a man like Lee Min-ho noticed everything, and that being noticed by him was not the same thing as mattering to him, and that she needed to stay clear on that distinction. She moved further into the room, so she'd have something else to look at. He sat down with an older man near the front windows and stayed for almost 40 minutes. The man's hands moved the whole time, the particular movement of someone trying to give shape to something that didn't yet have edges. Min-ho didn't check his phone, didn't look toward the door. He listened with the complete, unhurried weight of his attention, which she was already learning was a very specific thing, not performed listening. The real kind. The kind that cost something. When they stood, the older man held Min-ho's hand with both of his for a long moment. Min-ho said something she couldn't hear, and the man's shoulders dropped about 2 inches. The specific physical release of something held for so long that the body had stopped expecting to put it down. She was still thinking about that on the drive back. The families in this center, she said, when the city was moving past the windows again. They're not from Mapo district. He looked at her. The address forms on the registration board near the entrance. 3 different districts represented. Outer ring addresses, mostly. Several temporary housing placements. She kept her voice even. Those aren't neighborhood families using a community center. Those are people who were placed there. He held her gaze for a moment. Then, slowly, the programs are real. The cooking instructor has been there 3 years. The children enrolled in those classes are real children. He paused. But yes, the center's primary function is transitional stability for families who had to leave their previous situations under managed conditions. Managed by you. By my organization. The man tonight, she said. What did you tell him? Something moved in Min-ho's expression. The faint shift at the edge of it, not visible enough to name, just visible enough to register. His daughter, he said. We located her. 2 weeks ago, she's alive. We're working with a legal team on the retrieval. Candace looked at him. Where was she? He met her eyes without flinching. Somewhere she was taken to, without her knowledge or consent. The car moved through a long turn. She looked out the window at the passing city. She thought about the 2 inches, about what it costs to carry something that long and then be allowed to put it down. Who took her, she said. Min-ho said nothing, but the quality of his silence was an answer. She walked into his office at 8 the next morning with a printed summary of everything she'd found in the vendor registry and dropped it on his desk. He looked at the papers, looked at her, picked up the first page. The shell companies, she said, tell me what they actually are. They're traceable by design, he said, reading the second page. The contracts are real. The payments are real. The companies are shells because the people operating on the other end cannot have their actual identities in any government-accessible system without being identified and located within 72 hours. She sat down across from him. By whom? Chairman Kwon Tae-sung's operation has active infiltration in 3 government agencies. One of them is a division of the National Intelligence Service. He set the papers down and looked at her. Any individual whose real name appears in a traceable document becomes a target within 3 days. So the people I work with don't appear in traceable documents. The room was very quiet. You've been running a counter-operation against Kwon's network, she said. I've been providing infrastructure for people who have no other options. 4 years. 4 years. She pressed her hands flat on the desk. My father is the reason I have any government cooperation at all. She sat back. There it was. She thought about every careful thing her father had said and hadn't said over the past weeks. Not yet. Watch. She thought about the community center, the registration forms, the man with the moving hands. She thought about Minho watching her move through the shared access system on her first day, watching her find things, watching how fast she found them, watching what she did with what she found. The appointment, she said, is a protection mechanism. If your father's cooperation with this operation were to become public under the wrong framing, and there are people in this government actively building that framing, having you embedded here as a legitimate government appointee creates a paper trail that explains the relationship between the ministry and the Lee Group. You're using the appointment as cover. The appointment as cover. Yes. He held her gaze without apologizing for it. You're not in this building because you're useful as a shield, Ms. Brooks. You're here because you are the one person your father trusts enough to see the truth of this and not be managed by it. She looked at him for a long time. And then, I want to see the operation. He looked at her. Something shifted quiet, not announced. I thought you might, he said. The facility was a converted logistics space on the eastern edge of the city. 2 access routes, rotating entry codes, perimeter that looked like industrial security until you understood what was inside. She walked into a room where 17 families were being processed simultaneously. Relocation papers, identity documentation rebuilt from nothing because the originals had been taken or never existed in a form that helped them. Emergency legal petitions, medical records reconstructed by hand. Staff who'd been doing this long enough to have efficient systems and who still looked at each individual case file like it held a real person, because it held a real person. A woman at the corner desk was on her 4th call of a long night, walking someone through a process in a language Candace didn't immediately recognize. A photograph was pinned to the corner of her monitor. 3 children, young, looking directly at the camera the way children look before they learn to be careful. Minho stood in the center of the room and watched it run for a moment without announcing himself. Most of the staff glanced up and went back to their work, which told her how often he was here. Kwon's operation sources people, he said, quiet enough that the words were only for her. From transit countries, primarily. They end up in distribution chains across 3 continents. Most have no traceable documentation. Most have family members who don't know where they went and have no legal mechanism to find out. He looked at her. That is what the watch-listed organization is for. Candace looked at the room. The government infiltrators flag anyone searching for the missing families, she said, and then make them harder to find. Yes. She looked at the woman on the phone, at the photograph of 3 children. She had come into this building, ready to take it apart. She was standing in the middle of the reason she couldn't. She looked at Minho across the room. He was watching a staff member update a case file on the far wall, calm, focused, present in the specific way he was always present. Like every version of distraction had been cleared away years ago and never let back in. She thought about what it cost to build something like this. The exposure, the risk, the years of moving through it without anyone outside this room being allowed to know it existed. She thought about what it meant to choose to carry something that heavy, for that long, for people you would never meet. She thought about the word feared. She thought about the 40 minutes he'd sat with an old man and never once checked his phone. You're not what the file said, she said. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out the way true things sometimes do, without permission, without softening. Minho looked at her. No, he said, quiet, something behind his eyes she couldn't name yet. I know. He held her gaze for just a moment longer than necessary. Then he looked back at the room, and the moment was over, and Candace turned and looked at the woman on the phone with the photograph of 3 children and told herself to stay focused on the things she'd come here to understand. She was almost succeeding. If you've made it this far, and you want to know what happens when Lee Min-ho and Candace Brooks walk into the same room as the man who's been engineering all of this from the inside, stay right here. Because the gala scene coming up is not what either of them planned for. And after it, nothing in this story stays in the same position it was in before. The charity gala was not a party. Every event on Min-ho's calendar was a move, and this one was specific. 400 people in a controlled space where the relationships between power, obligation, and money expressed themselves in the grammar of seating arrangements and handshakes, and who stood near whom for how long. Candace had been fluent in that grammar since she was 14. She saw Assemblyman Choi Seung-ho the moment he arrived, because Min-ho saw him first. She'd spent enough weeks in the same building as Lee Min-ho to notice the small shift that moved through him when something required his complete assessment. He was at the far end of the hall when Choi came through the entrance, silver-haired, 60s, with the practiced social ease of a man who'd spent decades being exactly the right person at exactly the right events. He moved through the room like the space had been arranged to accommodate him, because in most rooms, it had been. Choi found Candace in 20 minutes. She'd been watching for it. She was near the eastern bar when he appeared at her left side, with the precision of someone who'd tracked her position from across the room and chosen the moment to cross it. Ms. Brooks, the smile came first, warm, rehearsed to the point where it looked unrehearsed. I've been hopping to speak with you since the appointment was announced. She turned to face him fully. Assemblyman. Your father made a brave choice. He tilted his head, the gesture of a man sharing something sincere. Some of our colleagues in the assembly were surprised. A minister with his record placing his daughter here. My father's decisions tend to make sense once you understand the full context, she said. Of course, I imagine you found Mr. Lee to be illuminating. He held his glass loosely. Easy. I suppose what interests me is whether what you found has matched what you expected when you first came through those doors. It wasn't a question. It was a probe. Precisely constructed, casually delivered, designed to produce a response that told him which direction she was oriented to. She held his gaze with the same pleasantness she'd carried in. I've found him to be exactly what I expected, once I stopped looking at only the surface. Something moved through Choi's eyes. Quick, gone before most people in that room would have been able to name it. How refreshing, he said. Please give your father my regards. Tell him I hope his health is holding. He moved on. Candace stood where she was and watched him re-enter the room. Watched him settle into a different conversation near the center of the hall. Watched his aide lean toward him with a murmured update. Watched Choi's eyes drift, once, briefly, without breaking his smile, back across the room toward her. Min-ho appeared at her left shoulder 30 seconds later, close enough that she could hear him under the noise of 400 people. He mentioned my father's health, she said before Min-ho could speak, as a closing remark. Min-ho went still beside her. She turned to look at him. This close in the low light of the hall, she could see the exact line where his composure held and where, underneath it, something else was running. He was not comfortable. For the first time since she'd walked into his building, he was not comfortable, and he wasn't entirely hiding it, which told her it was bad enough that hiding it entirely would cost too much. Choi doesn't mention things, he said. No, she agreed. He places them. They stood there together in the middle of a room full of people who had no idea what kind of conversation was happening 2 feet away from them, and Candace felt the air between her and Min-ho shift into something that hadn't been there before. Not safety, not comfort, something more specific than both of those things. The feeling of standing next to someone who is looking at the same target. She hadn't felt that with anyone outside her father's world. Min-ho didn't move away, didn't adjust the distance between them. Most men in a crowded room found ways to drift, to turn slightly, to create the buffer of being nearby without being together. He didn't do that. He stood exactly where he was, close enough that if she'd shifted her weight half an inch their shoulders would have touched, and watched Choi work the room with the focused stillness of a man tracking something that mattered. She looked at the side of his face, the line of his profile in the dim warmth of the gala lighting, the set of his jaw, the thing behind his eyes that she'd spent weeks trying to name and still couldn't, quite that quality that wasn't calm exactly, that was something more deliberate than calm, the kind of steadiness that's been built by choice rather than inherited. She realized she'd been looking at him for longer than she should have been. She looked back at Choi. "He's going to move on my father," she said. "Not here, but soon." "Yes," Minho's voice was very even. "That's what tonight was about." She looked at him. "Then what are we doing about it?" It wasn't a question. She'd planned to ask with the word "we" in it. He looked at her then, turned his head and actually looked at her, and whatever he saw, he held it for a moment before he said anything. "That," he said quietly, "is the right question." She didn't know what to do with the way he'd looked at her when she'd said "we." She filed it with everything else she was filing and told herself she'd figure it out later. She didn't think she'd actually wait until later. She didn't have a choice, though. Because whatever was going to happen next with Choi Seung-ho and her father, and the quiet counter-operation being run from the 38th floor of a glass tower was going to happen fast, and she needed to stay very clear on what she was here to do. She needed to stay clear. She was having a harder and harder time with that. And 11 days later, standing in her office at 11:43 at night, she stopped having to wonder why. But before that, before the document, before the routing path, before the moment everything she'd spent a month building turned over and showed her its other side, there was a Tuesday afternoon when she was sitting in the executive affairs office running vendor registry cross-references, and Lee Min-ho walked in without knocking. He didn't knock, she'd noticed. Not on her office, not on boardrooms, not on any door in the building. He simply moved through spaces like they were already his and trusted that whoever was on the other side would deal with it. Most people dealt with it. She'd decided, fairly early, that the only response to that particular quality in a man was to have something worth interrupting. He set a thin document on the edge of her desk. "Community funding report for the next quarter," he said. "Your signature needs to be on it as Executive Affairs Director before it goes to the Ministry Liaison." She looked at the document, looked at him. "Why does my signature need to be on a community funding report?" "Because your appointment includes ministry oversight responsibilities for the Lee Foundation operations." He looked back at her with that particular patience. "Which is in the orientation document." "Page 11, she said. "Section 4. General oversight of affiliated charitable operations." "You read it." "I read everything." He looked at her for a moment, not the quick checking glance, the actual version. "I know," he said. She held his gaze. Something about the way he said those two words, not like an observation, but like a fact he'd been sitting with for a while, moved through her in a way she didn't quite have a name for yet. She picked up the pen and signed the document. He picked it up, started to leave. "Minho." He stopped. "The Mapo Center," she said. "The expansion request on page 3, the request for the second residential wing." She hadn't planned to say this either. "It's a good plan. The capacity projections are accurate." He turned and looked at her from the doorway. She kept her expression level. "I reviewed 3 comparable facilities as part of my orientation research. The staffing model is efficient and the intake projections are conservative. You should approve it." He looked at her for another moment. "I know," he said. And then he was gone, and she was sitting in her office with the pen still in her hand, and the vendor registry still open on her screen, and the very specific awareness that she had just told Lee Min-ho he should approve something, not challenged him, not interrogated him, not tried to take something apart. She'd just helped. She stared at the screen for a moment. Then she went back to the cross-references, because she was here to find the truth, and finding the truth was still what she was doing, and none of the things she'd seen in the past weeks had changed that. She kept telling herself that. She was mostly believing it. She'd been running a search on Choi's registered political donor filings, a thread she'd been building since the gala, when a system flag appeared at the corner of her screen. Small. The kind of administrative notification most people dismiss as noise. She didn't dismiss it. A communication log entry, internal, time-stamped 6 days ago, routed through a partitioned section of the Executive Communications Archive she'd been granted temporary access to for a documentation audit, a window that was supposed to close at 10 but hadn't. Someone on the IT security rotation had missed the end time. The communication was encrypted. Content inaccessible at her clearance level, but the header metadata was visible, routing origin. Recipient address, timestamp. Sender. She looked at the sender ID and held very still. She knew it. She'd known it since childhood. It appeared on the official correspondence her father brought home in his briefcase. On the headers of ministry documents she'd been reading since she was 12, sitting on the floor of his home office because she wanted to understand what he did, and he'd always let her look. Minister David Brooks' internal government identifier. She told herself it wasn't surprising. She'd accepted that her father and Minho communicated. She'd accepted weeks ago that the agreement between them was real and active. She pulled up the routing path. It took 4 minutes to follow completely, because it had been deliberately obscured. Not panicked obscuring, not the frantic kind that happens when someone is covering tracks under pressure. Methodical. The kind that happens when someone has had time to decide exactly which server logs preserve which metadata, and which ones don't. The communication had not traveled through standard government communications infrastructure. It had gone through a private relay server. She ran the registration. Followed the chain through 2 intermediate entities, both registered within the past 4 years, both physical addresses that turned out to be law firm suites. She followed it to the parent holding company. The parent holding company appeared in a legal filing from 4 years ago. A civil matter. Settled confidentially. She ran the filing number. The defendant was Chairman Kwon Tae-sung. She sat back in her chair. The floor was empty. The building was quiet the way it is at midnight, climate systems, distant elevators, the weight of the structure doing nothing. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city was indifferent and enormous and completely uninvolved in what was sitting on her screen. Her father had sent an encrypted communication through a private relay server, registered, through a chain of shell entities, to a holding company that bore Kwon Tae-sung's name in a 4-year-old legal filing. The same 4 years of Minho's counteroperation. The same 4 years of her father's cooperation. The same 4 years that a relay server had existed between them that traced back to the man they were both supposedly fighting. She looked at her father's sender ID at the top of the log and felt something she hadn't felt since she was 19 years old, and discovered for the first time that the world was not structured the way she'd been told it was. She felt played. The anger arrived cold. Not hot, not loud, not the kind that needs an audience. The kind that settles into the base of your chest and makes decisions without asking for permission. The kind that doesn't announce itself. She didn't know yet which version of this was true. Didn't know if her father was protecting something she hadn't reached yet, hiding something she wasn't meant to find, or if he had been compromised in a direction she didn't have the information to fully understand. She didn't know if the relay registration was a coincidence, a thread, or the visible surface of something that went much deeper. But she knew the routing path was real. She knew Kwon's name in that filing was real. And she knew that somewhere in this building, 1 floor above her, still at his desk at midnight the same way he was always still at his desk at midnight, was a man who had told her your father is the reason any of this works. And she needed to know right now what that sentence was actually made of, and whether it meant what he'd said it meant, or something else entirely. She closed every window, collected the documents, picked up her jacket, rode the elevator up 1 floor, didn't call ahead. Didn't knock. She walked straight in. Lee Min-ho was at his desk, 1 lamp burning in the dark of the late office, a document in front of him. He looked up the moment she came through the door, and she saw him take in her expression, not her presence, her expression, and she saw him shift into a different gear. Not alarm. Something sharper than alarm. The kind of focused attention that means someone has already understood this conversation cannot wait until morning. She crossed the room and dropped a single printed page on his desk. He looked at it, read it, and when he looked back up at her, his face gave her almost nothing, which told her everything. Long, she said, and her voice was very quiet now, the way serious things go quiet. "Have you known that the relay server traces back to Kwon's holding company?" Office held that question. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Seoul moved through its midnight without them, enormous and indifferent, and completely unaware that everything Candace Brooks had understood about the last month was sitting in pieces on a desk between her and the most feared man in Korea. Lee Min-ho looked at her. He set the document he'd been reading face down on the desk. And for the first time since she'd walked into this building, he looked like he was deciding something he had been specifically trying not to decide. The silence stretched. She looked at him across the desk, at the document turned face down, at his hands resting still on the surface of it, at the expression on his face that was the most unguarded thing she'd seen from him in a month. And she felt the cold anger in her chest go absolutely still. Because she realized, standing in that office at midnight with the printed routing path between them, that whatever answer was coming was going to be more complicated than she'd prepared herself for. And that the man looking back at her from across that desk had been carrying something for 4 years that she was only just beginning to understand the weight of. And that she didn't know, not yet, not right now, whether that made him the person she'd been sent here to expose, or the one person in this entire city who actually knew the whole truth.